Welcome back, PetaPixel viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and look at this. I have a pre-production Canon EOS R1. It is finally here. Spoiler alert, the Canon EOS R1 is going to be an effective platform for shooting wildlife and sports, but now I want to get some of those expensive RF telephoto lenses because they are better than the EF versions. How can I afford that? I'm going to go to kh.com. So the first thing is I can trade in my old EF sports and telephoto lenses and get fantastic value towards some new RF glass. So by trading in my old gear to get something that's new to me, I'm going to get a 10% bonus to that trade-in value, and I know that KH is going to give me a fair price. As well, I love that all their used equipment that I'm going to purchase is rated on a very extensive basis for how good the condition is, so I know exactly what I get for my money. And if I get the product and it's not right for me, KH gives you a very generous return policy as well as a 180-day warranty in case anything does go wrong with the lens. And it's because of that and so much more that kh.com is PetaPixel's official pre-owned camera gear partner. Now, before we get into the video, just a little bit of housekeeping. First off, Canon has flown Jordan and I and Jaron down here to Phoenix, Arizona to play with the new R1 as well as the R5 Mark II. Put us up in a hotel, very nice, but as usual, that's not going to influence our review in any way, shape, or form. The other thing I want to mention here is that the R5 II and the EOS R1, these are quite early pre-production, okay? We're still working with pre-production firmware. Now, because we're looking at two cameras, we have very limited time to play with it. We're not going to be doing a full review or anything like that, or spec rundown. That just doesn't make sense at this point. Again, these cameras have early firmware, but we do have an interesting opportunity to test some of the new features. So what we're going to talk about is our 5 favorite things that we think are exciting about the brand new EOS R1. That's going to be our video today. And then as we have more time, we'll evaluate this further later on. We're also going to be doing a lot of the spec talk on the PetaPixel podcast, so you'll definitely want to catch that as well. Okay, so Jordan's fast, but not as fast as the stack sensor in the R1. So this is probably the fastest stack sensor we've seen in a full frame camera like this. Basically 1/300th of a second scan speed. That's faster than Nikon Z8, but remember, this is doing it at 24 megapixels, not at 45 megapixels. That makes sense though, because this camera really is solidly aimed at journalism, sports, action, and wildlife, where you don't necessarily need or want high megapixels. Now, unlike the Nikon Z8 and Z9, the Canon EOS R1 does still have a mechanical shutter going up to 12 frames per second. And Canon is saying that's important for certain sports and action where you might just have really variable high frequency advertisements, LED boards and stuff like that behind sports players, where the mechanical will get rid of any sort of weird banding issues. But for the most part, because the sensor is reading out so fast, I would happily shoot this in electronic shutter mode. I can get bursts up to 40 frames per second. This does also have a pre-continuous burst mode, so it'll restore the half second before I actually touch the shutter. That's great to get that decisive moment. And another reason why I would happily shoot this camera in electronic shutter only mode for most situations, because it's still doing 14-bit RAWs in electronic shutter mode, and that is a fantastic feature to have. All right, let's talk about the EVF now on the EOS R1. So this is a big upgrade. This goes to 9.44 million dots, 0.9 times magnification. This is very similar to what we see on the Sony A1 or A7 R5. And what I like about the EVF, we're not getting any sort of resolution drop while autofocusing. You get blackout-free shooting when you're doing electronic shutter shooting. And this EVF is physically massive in the back of it. I mean, it's a huge piece of glass. So Canon is saying that this is to actually aid the field of view when you're calibrating for eye control autofocus. Larger field of view, more accurate eye control autofocus. And again, this works for my eyes, but poor Jordan, it still will not work for his. So next thing I want to talk about in the EOS R1, because we have better processing power, we actually now have two new features that use deep learning. So the first one, you can up-res your images. This only works on JPEGs, but it lets you basically go 4 times your megapixel count. So on this camera, I can get about 96 megapixels. So what this up-resing does, it only works on individual JPEGs. This isn't pixel shift technology. We're not combining multiple shots together to get more detail and higher megapixel count, because frankly, for most journalistic or sports situations, you can't use pixel shift. And you're moving the camera, your subjects are moving. This could be really useful, for example, if you've cropped tight on a player or a subject, but you want to restore some of those megapixels for publication. That's where this works very well. What I actually found far more useful myself was shooting in this low light situation where we're getting high ISOs in our photos. Canon now has digital noise reduction. This is cool. This actually is in the raw image processing in camera, so it works on a raw file. It's going to remove a lot of that noise using AI deep learning technology. And we actually have this on the R1 and the R5 Mark II. And what we're seeing here is actually quite a bit more detail, less noise, actually restoring some lost detail. And so I think this feature is working really well. Okay, so next let's talk about autofocusing on the Canon EOS R1, because this really is going to be one of the main features of this camera. The R1 does promise to be the best autofocusing camera Canon has made. A big part of that is the faster scanning sensor, more calculations per second, and of course also the larger EVF that gives you better eye control calibration. But most importantly, it is the sensor itself. They've rotated the cross-type sensors on here to make sure that your subjects will always have good contrast and good detail to focus off of. As well, now this has the latest autofocusing algorithms that Canon makes. We've actually got quite a big change, not only on the R1, but the R5 Mark II as well. And that is just the overall interface for autofocusing. Canon cameras for the longest time had very different case modes for different situations, and now the Canons are far more simplified. You either have an auto mode where it will just detect the kind of case situation that works best, or you can tweak to some degree if you want to have a stickier tracking, more locked onto a subject, or something more responsive for quick action, things coming into the frame and focusing on that. Regardless, it's a much simpler system to get a handle on. So advanced photographers still can absolutely go down the rabbit hole setting up the Canons to behave exactly how they want for autofocus. And frankly, that's pretty complicated. It goes beyond the context of this video. But at the same time, Canon is trying to do more of the heavy lifting in the background with a lot of its deep learning technology. So they actually have a new thing called action priority. This is where I can specifically choose soccer, basketball, or volleyball, which has been appropriate for today. Absolutely. But I'm sure we'll see more of those in the future as, you know, things expand. Different sports can be added to that. And I mean, this is going to take a lot of testing when we finally fully review these cameras to see exactly what kind of performance we're going to get. Okay, so that's pretty much everything that I want to cover on the Canon EOS R1. We're going to leave the Arizona Athletics group. We're going to go back to the hotel, and Jordan's going to talk about his video impressions that he really likes on the new Canon R1.
All right, Jordan, to talk about why I love the Canon R1 as a video camera. And what I really like if you're doing a lot of high-speed work, this is a camera that can record oversampled 4K up to 60 frames per second. But I have to admit, I was a little disappointed. This sensor is definitely capable of capturing oversampled 4K 120, but unfortunately, it does have to switch to a subsampled mode. As well, this is a 6K sensor, and we can record 6K video, but only if you're willing to record Canon RAW. Now, those are going to be huge file types. They do give you a lot of flexibility in post, but that's the only way you're going to access the most detailed footage this camera can capture. But for me, the big upgrade on this camera, and the reason I'd choose one over the R3, besides the lack of rolling shutter that we get from the faster sensor readout, is that this can capture Canon's C-Log 2, which is my absolute favorite of their log profiles, captures more dynamic range, and I just find it grades much nicer. It's really welcome to see that. And we get a tally lamp. Chris and I, we love tally lamps, but weirdly, this doesn't have the waveform that we saw on the R5 Mark II.
So playing with this very early Canon EOS R1 was an interesting experience because, I mean, let's be honest, this is a huge launch for Canon. The R1 has been a long time coming, and there was a lot of conjecture on whether the R1 would even come out and when was it going to be. And then Canon did give their early development announcement. The R1's coming. We're like, oh, is it going to be in time for the Olympics? How long do we have to wait for it? And I have to admit, this is way earlier than I thought I would get a chance to look at this camera. But honestly, the Canon EOS R1, it's not close to final yet. There's still a lot of work that has to be done here. And part of it too is our expectations. I mean, we're looking at flagship cameras thinking things like Nikon Z9, Sony A1, cameras that are very versatile, have higher megapixel counts, can do many different kinds of photography well. And it's clear that this camera is definitely aimed more at sports and journalism. But with the limited time that we've had to play with this camera, we just cannot make any solid claims about it. So it leaves us a lot of questions about overall image quality, things like what's the raw performance going to be like in video, dynamic range. And so with a little bit of time that we've had, we can at least get a good idea of where Canon's going with handling and the autofocus performance. And I do have to say, the handling and the autofocus performance on this camera are fantastic. The hit rate for our sport shots were fantastic, even in lower light situations. But look, although Canon is saying that this is their new flagship camera, I still can't help but feel that it's really aimed more at a specific niche of photography, journalism, and sports. I mean, the dual CF Express card slots is great. The relatively low megapixels, though, the fast burst rates, it's excellent for that kind of photography, but it doesn't really make me think of a camera that competes against the Z9 or the A1. Far more against things like the A9 III or honestly Canon's own EOS R3. Perhaps this will pave the way for other R1 models. Maybe we'll see an R1S or an R1X or something like that. But I don't know what this is going to do to the Canon EOS R3, because in a lot of ways this feels more like an upgrade to the R3 than it does anything else. But when we get a final version, we're absolutely going to put this camera through its paces. It certainly has a lot of potential, and it does have one of the fastest reading sensors you'll ever get in a full frame market, and that is very important. So anyways, hopefully you guys stick around and watch more of our content so you don't miss that final review when it does come. And also do remember to check out the PetaPixel podcast. It's on the exact same channel, or you can listen to it on all your favorite podcasting apps. Just search for PetaPixel podcast. And if you saw Jordan talking about what he really liked about this camera, and you saw him rocking that PetaPixel shirt, and you're like, damn, I want that too, you can get it. Go check out our merch. Go to store.petapixel.com and get those for yourself today. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. We'll see you soon with more on PetaPixel.